You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. On today's programme, Germany's cabinet agrees to cut carbon emissions by an extra 10%. We speak to climate activist Luisa Neuberger, who forced the new proposals. How cities around the world are and aren't adapting to climate change. And why protecting peatlands could help save the planet. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and meet those coming up with the solutions. And we aim to take you to the heart of the climate crisis, explain the data driving the changes that are already affecting us, but also show you just how far we've come. The German cabinet has approved plans for ambitious new targets to reduce carbon emissions. It comes after a landmark ruling from the country's constitutional court, which found that current laws are insufficient to protect future generations. One of the environmental activists involved in the case is Luisa Neuberger. She's one of the main organisers of the Fridays for Future school strikes movement and is hugely influential in the climate world. I spoke to her earlier and started by asking if she's satisfied with the new climate commitments from the German government.
This isn't about what satisfies me or anyone else, but this is about governments aligning the climate policies to the science and to Paris. And the court in Germany ruled that the government needs to listen to the science and, stick to the Paris Agreement, because they didn't do so in the past. And now they did agree, in fact, on higher targets, but they're still in line with Paris. So, of course, we're going to keep fighting here.
Well, the changes that came about in Germany came about because you went to court and you won. So is litigation the most effective way of making change rather than street activism?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't put this in some kind of hierarchy here. What we see is that we need to try everything we can. And so I would rather understand this as a huge puzzle. And, litigation is one piece of that puzzle, and street action, climate action, civil disobedience, working inside institutions, that are different puzzles. And, ideally, eventually, they come up together and they add up and they produce that kind of pressure and awareness that we so desperately need. I mean, I feel, this litigation victory was huge, but we cannot solve the climate crisis court case by court case simply because, these court systems work very, very slowly. It took over a year for the court to decide that a climate target that was decided in 2019 isn't ambitious enough. So I feel, we need to also understand that these climate cases, these litigation cases, they can provide a foundation for our work as activists to then come back to that and actually demand our rights to be turned into politics.
As well as the court case, you've been helping organise the school strikes in Germany. How did you first get started in that? What first motivated you to get involved?
Well, I never planned to become a climate activist, simply because I thought that governments in the 21st century would get things done. And I mean, the science is there and we see what the climate crisis does today. And I thought, there were people who were aware of all that and would sort things out, by the end of the day. And when I found out a couple of years after the Paris Agreement was signed, what was happening around the world and also in Germany, how governments were just failing so badly to stick what they themselves committed to do, I got very irritated and angry, and by coincidence or so, I ended up at the climate conference in Poland in 2018, and I ran into Greta Thunberg, and apparently she was the only one who acted like we were in a crisis on this UN climate conference. And so I went back home and was like, okay, I think we need to do something, and I think I need to do something.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other climate news. And the first major offshore wind farm in the United States has been given the go-ahead. The Vineyard Wind Project will be located 14 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. It's expected to create enough electricity to power 400,000 homes in New England and create 3,600 jobs. The project's application was cancelled by Donald Trump last year before being reinstated by President Biden after he took office. The EU will tighten regulations on air pollution, waste and the use of chemicals. It's all part of a plan to protect public health and address key causes of biodiversity loss. The EU Commission says it wants to cut premature deaths associated with air pollution by at least 55% by 2030. And Amazon has issued its first sustainability bond to raise funds in order to transition to more environmentally responsible business practices. The retailer wants to raise $1 billion to invest in renewable energy, clean transport, greener buildings and affordable housing. Now, 1 in 4 cities around the world can't afford to protect themselves against climate change, even though nearly all are facing serious risks. The charity Carbon Disclosure Project received data from 812 cities on their environmental plans, and they found that 93% of them are facing significant climate impacts, such as flooding, extreme heat and storms. But there are things that cities are doing to tackle the climate crisis and make themselves more resilient. So 20% have increased tree planting or created green spaces. 18% have undertaken flood mapping. 15% are improving community engagement and education, and 14% are developing crisis management plans, including warning and evacuation systems. But more than half don't yet have a climate action plan. That means they're more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Well, joining me now is Luisa Neuberger, who's Professor in Sustainable Engineering at Cardiff University. So what does this survey tell us, do you think, about the level of preparedness of the world's cities in the face of climate change?
This is, we have known this for a long time, is that although the science is out there, we know that the impacts of climate change will be felt. But cities have not prepared themselves as such.
What kind of problems could they face, and what kind of steps might they be able to take to build up resilience?
Well, as you have mentioned in there, that one of the key impacts, the floods, for example, extreme heat. A lot of cities are heavily built up, they're dense. And not only because of the climate change, but because of the volume and the density of buildings, the temperatures will be, there will be further increase in temperatures, which will have further impacts. You also have impacts related to age and gender. So elderly and the infirm and children will be more affected. You also have, in some cities, you also have a significant level of population growth and urbanization, which will also exacerbate the problem. At the other end of the spectrum, you would see that the impacts are not going to be felt at the same time throughout the year. So in some cities, we have seen predictions and projections that winters are going to be warmer. In other cities, summers are going to be warmer. So in a way, the impacts will be differently felt, and is not a one solution for all. And cities, particularly in the south, have not been able to prepare themselves for climate change, although some of them are going to be disproportionately affected by it.
Professor Luisa Neuberger, thanks very much indeed. The government's introducing a new scheme which will allow developers to damage green spaces in one part of England, but then pay to improve them in another. Biodiversity offsetting as part of the Environment Bill, which was introduced in the Queen's speech yesterday. Under the proposed plans, developers will have to increase the variety of animals and plants found on each development site by 10% elsewhere. The government hopes it will allow more development on greenbelt land whilst improving wildlife habitats. Gerard Tubb reports.
The Escrick Park estate in North Yorkshire will be ready if and when the Environment Bill is passed to offset biodiversity loss from private development.
There's absolutely masses of opportunity.
The landowner here was chosen for a Natural England pilot scheme as a biodiversity compensation provider.
It means that we will be able to offer biodiversity to what has been destroyed from development, plus an extra 10%, which is going to be embodied in the environmental bill, hopefully this year. So at least people who are living in new housing estates or occupying new offices will know that somewhere, hopefully close by, there's a really flourishing new wildlife habitat.
But this development site near Barnsley shows the concept can cause anger. Many local authorities are already insisting on a biodiversity net gain.
Guidance on offsetting says to keep as much within the footprint of the development as possible. And this has been offset to a location 6 miles away, which is of no interest or relevance to the people here.
The government insists developers will be incentivised to keep wildlife habitats on site or nearby. But it also plans eventually to allow biodiversity credits to be bought and sold on the open market. Biodiversity offsetting is here to stay. Gerard Tubbs, Sky News, North Yorkshire.
So the government's using an offsetting system to improve biodiversity in England. But what other nature-based solutions are out there? Well, scientists from the British Ecological Society have examined how all kinds of landscapes could be used to combat the climate crisis. They say we need to get serious about peatlands if we want to cut emissions. So, what's so great about peat?
If the UK wants to get serious about its carbon emissions, it needs to get serious about its peatlands. They are the most carbon-dense terrestrial store of carbon on the planet. They're like giant, ever-expanding safety vaults underneath our feet. But, and there is a problem, 80% have been damaged. There is something that just about everyone in the UK can do. If you're a gardener, to stop using peat-based composts. So every time you buy a bag, you are helping to destroy an area of peatland. Then we can start looking at how to restore them. And that restoration process involves re-wetting them. We need to then start looking at the vegetation that's growing on them and potentially start to revegetate them. These peatlands can be our most important way of capturing some of the excess CO2 that's in our atmosphere. So it's incredibly important that we look after our peatlands.
Coming up on tomorrow's Daily Climate Show, we'll be looking at what British farmers need to do to help combat climate change. You can catch that here on Sky News at the same time and on our social channels and website. Thanks for watching. See you then.